Deborah Lee Atrops was born in Florence, Oregon on June 4, 1958. In the 1970s, she attended South Salem High School before her family moved to Spokane, Washington, where she joined the Honor Guard and even rode on a float with the then President Richard Nixon. She was described as sweet, and high school is where she met her future husband, Robert Atrops. After graduation, her family returned to Salem, and Deborah began pursuing an accounting degree at Chemeketa Community College. The couple didn't have a child of their own, and even as the marriage soured, they decided to adopt. In 1988, 30-year-old Deborah became a new mom, soon to be a single one. That July, the couple separated. Deborah moved back to Salem to be near her parents and into the Cambridge East apartments. She worked as a bookkeeper, and custody exchanges became part of life. Divorce felt inevitable, and arrangements for custody and child support for baby Rihanna were on the horizon. Tuesday, November 29, 1988, after work at Welland Inc. in Sherwood, Deborah drove to a 5:15 p.m. hair appointment in Tigard and left around 7. The plan was ordinary: stop by Robert's place in Sherwood, pick up 7-month-old Rihanna, and head home. She never made it. Around 9:30, Robert began calling friends, family, and 911 to report her missing. Calls, he said, came from his home phone. Investigators later found no record of those calls and concluded he likely wasn't at home when they were made. On November 30th, several Beaverton locals noticed a new black 1988 Honda Accord oddly parked at a dead end off Southwest Murray Boulevard near Southwest Joels Ferry Road. The driver's window down and no license plates. Nothing looked obviously wrong, so no one called it in. On December 1st, a city worker did, mainly because of the location, a new car abandoned at a remote construction site in the cold with a window down. It was Deborah's car. When officers opened the trunk, they found Deborah deceased, her clothes caked in mud. The same mud was smeared on the hood, steering wheel, gear shift, and front right tire. It appeared similar to the mud in the front yard of the log cabin where Robert was living, the place Deborah was headed to pick up the baby. Authorities released the vehicle back to the lender before further testing. The medical examiner determined Deborah had been manually strangled before being placed in the trunk of her car. Detectives learned she and Robert were still married but separated, and that she was preparing to file for divorce. Friends and co-workers described troubling behavior, controlling and sometimes physically violent, and said Deborah had confided she was scared. She had allegedly started a relationship at work with a married co-worker, John Pearson, and Robert had confronted her about it. Deborah told John that if Robert found out, he would kill her. Decades later, on November 28, 2022, Pearson went to a bar, got drunk, and led Crook County Sheriff's deputies on a chase. He was charged with several crimes, including eluding, failed to appear for trial on March 15, 2024, and later moved out of Oregon. Months after the failure to appear warrant, deputies located him at an RV park in Mojave County, Arizona, where, while they were attempting to serve a material witness warrant, he took his own life. Prosecutors later said he was depressed after losing his son, and he believed he was too ill to survive incarceration. They also said there was no evidence linking him to the crime, and his wife backed his alibi that he was asleep at home. He had cooperated and voluntarily provided a DNA sample. In 2020, detectives pulled Deborah's boxes back onto the table. Detective Kevin Winfield located additional witnesses and sent clothing and soil collected in 1988 for modern testing. DNA was found on the collar and neck area of Deborah's coat and was consistent with Robert's, but ultimately inconclusive. The FBI compared mud from Deborah's car with mud from Robert's property. The samples were described as indistinguishable. Investigators also documented that Robert sold roofing materials at construction sites near where the car was abandoned. Context that suddenly felt important. When Winfield interviewed him again in 2022, Robert's account conflicted with what he'd said decades earlier. A grand jury indicted him, and he was arrested for second-degree murder 34 years after the crime. The trial in early 2025 lasted 3 weeks. In April, a Washington County jury found 70-year-old Robert guilty of second-degree murder. On July 8th, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Deborah was an Oregon woman who loved quiet things, fresh air, and a good trail. That was taken from her. The record now says what happened and who did it. Robert lived free for nearly 4 decades. At sentencing, Rihanna, an adopted infant then, now an adult, spoke about losing the father who raised her, a stark measure of how many lives this crime bent across the years. Matthew John Dunmire was 31 when he died in March 2021. Nothing in public reporting points to a violent past, certainly nothing like what he'd later be accused of. In 2017, Chelsea Perkins reported to Virginia Beach police that Matthew sexually assaulted her. Detectives said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges, and the claim remained an allegation. 4 years later, early March 2021, during a night out, Matthew told coworkers he planned to meet a woman he knew previously and had reconnected with online. A message came in. His supervisor watched him step outside and get into a white smart car, later tied by plate readers to Perkins's household. There's no indication she posed as someone else. She arrived in her husband's smart car, and the short-term rental was booked in her own name. They spent the night there. The next morning, March 6th, she drove him to the Terra Vista Natural Study Area in Valley View, inside Cuyahoga Valley National Park. They walked past the old cemetery, stepped off the trail, and moved into the trees. In that quiet stretch of woods, she brought a 9mm handgun and fired a single shot. Because it happened on federal parkland, the case landed in federal court. Late that morning, hikers reported hearing one shot. Another pair met a woman, later identified as Perkins, dressed in black with knee-high boots, asking for directions to the cemetery. 3 days later, around 11 a.m. on March 9th, hikers found Matthew's body near Terra Vista Cemetery. An Aquafina water bottle sat beside him. Perkins didn't linger. That same day, she messaged a Detroit-area tattoo artist that she was in Cleveland and needed to make a stop first, then drove to Michigan to get a tattoo of a noose on her forearm before returning east. Toll and travel records back up that trip. Investigators built the case piece by piece. GPS logs, surveillance video, and phone records put her with Matthew and inside the park. Plate reader hits tied the white car to her household. A search of the Virginia residence turned up 3 9mm pistols. Forensics identified DNA from both Perkins and Matthew on the Aquafina bottle. Agents also recovered a deleted note on her phone, crafted to look like Matthew had written it himself, created around the time his body was found. Ballistics analysis was part of the evidence set. The digital trail, physical evidence, and the staged note all pointed the same direction. 9 months after the discovery, on December 9th, 2021, agents arrested Perkins in Pensacola, Florida. Grief inside Matthew's family spiraled into something tragic that fall. On November 5th, 2021, frustrated there'd been no arrest, his mother, Tommy Lynn Dunmire, disguised herself as a delivery driver in Washington, D.C., and shot a woman she mistakenly believed was connected to her son's death. The victim survived. Tommy later died by suicide. Her longtime partner, John Nelson McQuillan, pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 42 months in prison, followed by supervised release. Perkinson's path drew attention on its own. A stint in the Coast Guard, then subscription-based online adult content under an alias. In May 2025, facing the evidence, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and to using a firearm during and in relation to a violent crime on federal property. On September 9, 2025, a judge sentenced her to 22.5 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. People sometimes ask, Did she kill her rapist years later? The precise answer is this. She killed a man she had accused in 2017 of sexual assault. He was never charged. He was never convicted. Matthew was remembered as a free spirit who loved music, loved playing his guitar, and loved being with his friends. Rea Rasmussen was born on June 15, 1976, in Orange County, California. She was only 2 to 4 years old when her life was taken and her remains placed in a barrel on a wooded lot near Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire. For decades, she was just the middle child. Now she has her name, and with Rea identified, all 4 victims in this case finally do. Authorities announced the identification in early September 2025, closing a gap that began with 2 grim discoveries. Inside the first barrel were an adult woman and 2 young girls. The woman was later identified as Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch. The children, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters, were Marlise's daughters. 15 years later, in 2000, a second barrel was discovered shockingly close to where the first one was found in 1985. The barrel contained the remains of a third child, who became known only as the middle child and remained unidentified until now. Rea was born in 1976 in Orange County, California. How investigators reached Rea's name is a story of patience and modern forensics. In 2024, New Hampshire State Police partnered with the DNA Doe Project. Genealogists built a family tree with roughly 25,000 people. A key DNA lead pointed to an obituary mentioning a daughter named Pepper Reed. With Pepper's name in hand, investigators found a 1976 Orange County birth record for a baby girl, Rea Rasmussen, daughter of Pepper Reed and Terry Rasmussen. A family DNA comparison made it official in early September 2025. Rea's parents anchor the rest of this story. Her mother, Pepper, was born in 1952 and raised in Texas. She hasn't been seen since the late 1970s and is presumed to be one of Terry Rasmussen's victims. Rea's father, Terry Peter Rasmussen, born in 1943, moved through states and aliases for years. Investigators believe he killed Rea and also murdered Marlise, Marie, and Sarah. Rasmussen died in prison in 2010 while serving time behind bars for an unrelated California murder conviction. A few human details help Rea stand apart from the paperwork. Officials note she likely had darker hair than the other girls and a slight overbite. There's no known photographs of her, only reconstructions and the science that finally brought her name home. Rasmussen's trail threads through multiple identities. In New Hampshire, he was Bob Evans. In California, he used names like Gordon Jensen and Larry Vanner. In 1986, he abandoned a little girl, long known as Lisa, at a Santa Cruz area trailer park. Years later, DNA would reveal she was Dawn, the daughter of his then-girlfriend, Denise Bowden, who vanished from Manchester, New Hampshire in 1981 and is still missing. In 1999, he met Unsun June in Richmond, California. In 2002, he murdered her and left her under a pile of cat litter. That conviction finally put him behind bars. Here's where the case still needs help. Investigators are mapping Rasmussen's movements from 1974 to 1985, especially across New Hampshire, California, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, and Virginia. Pepper's disappearance remains an active case. Denise Bowden is also presumed dead. Detectives believe there are likely more victims. And because cases echo into other stories, a public tip once tied to Bear Brook didn't solve the barrels, but it did help identify another New Hampshire teen, Elizabeth Liz Lamott, whose remains were found in Tennessee in 1985. Officials have said there's no reason at this time to link her death to Rasmussen, but it shows how one investigation can open doors for another. Rea, Marie, Sarah, Marlise, 4 names restored after decades. 2 women, Pepper and Denise, still missing. An estranged daughter, Diane Klopfer, whose father left when she was 6. She was able to provide DNA in her 40s when she learned her father was the Bear Brook killer. If you know anything about Rea Rasmussen's movements in the mid-1970s to mid-1980s, or about Denise Bowden, please contact the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit. Even the smallest memory could matter. Robert Gary Spohr was born on February 4, 1951, in Imperial, California, and went by his middle name Gary. He met Wendy Wood in college, and they married in 1976 and moved through life as a team. In the late 70s and 80s, they lived in Afghanistan and Hong Kong. Years later, they settled on Lake Tahoe's west shore in Homewood. Big windows to the water, high ceilings, travel photos everywhere. Their dog, Maggie, wandered the kitchen like she owned it. 50 years together, 45 married. June 5, 2021, felt like an easy lake day. Their older daughter, Erin, stopped by with the boys, one 3, one 8 months. They hung out by the water. Gary started dinner upstairs. Around 7:45 p.m., Erin loaded the kids to head back to Reno. Wendy slipped her a $90,000 check to help with the indoor riding ring. What nobody inside knew, hours earlier, cameras caught a hooded person in a white mask and a backpack near Hurricane Bay. They crossed West Lake Boulevard and went up the driveway. No broken glass, no forced entry. Someone slipped in and waited. After Erin left, the shooter came out. Gary, 70, was killed with a .22 caliber round. Wendy, 68, was shot twice in the head and once in the hand. She managed to dial 911 but couldn't speak. When deputies arrived, they found Gary near the upstairs living area by the fireplace, and Wendy in the bathroom, barely hanging on. She was flown to a hospital in Reno and spent about a month in the ICU. Wendy had significant brain damage. She had to relearn basics: walking, talking, eating. For day-to-day help, she later moved into an assisted living facility to keep working at recovery. She tried short hikes, handwriting practice, but trauma lingers. In March 2023, at that facility, she took her own life. The family believes the shooter took both of their parents. Detectives focused on how deliberate this was. No similar break-ins, nothing ransacked. Cameras showed the masked person arriving well before the 911 call. Over time, pieces lined up: shell casings, a blood drop in the garage, sightings in Nevada the night before, and phone data tracking movement toward Tahoe. Investigators came to believe Samantha Scott, close to Erin and by then involved with Erin's husband, drove with him toward the lake. Samantha later admitted she drove him to Tahoe City and said she thought it was a drug run, not violence. Motive talk wasn't new. Money stress, resentment, a nasty fight over $1.3 million tied to a ranch property and renovation. There were messages and earlier threats, including one where he allegedly said he'd kill them one day. There was a long pattern of financial help from Gary and Wendy, right down to that $90,000 check that afternoon, and prosecutors said he'd gotten a $70,000 dream car check weeks before. 2 years to the day after Gary's death, June 5, 2023, civil suits hit. Adrienne, the younger daughter, sued Erin and her husband, alleging a conspiracy. Erin countersued, saying Adrienne manipulated their mother to change the family trust. The court put the civil case on pause while the criminal case moved. October 20th, 2023, former Major League Baseball pitcher Dan Serafini, Erin's husband, was picked up in Winnemucca, Nevada. Samantha Scott was arrested in Las Vegas. Placer County worked with the U.S. Marshals and local agencies. Charges for Serafini included murder, attempted murder, burglary, and child endangerment because 2 small kids had been at the home earlier. Scott was initially charged alongside him. By February 2025, Scott pleaded guilty to being an accessory. She'd already been locked up about 16 months and was released with credit for time served. Serafini kept his not guilty plea, so the case went to trial. Trial started mid-May 2025 in Auburn and ran about 6 weeks. Jurors heard about planning and lying in wait. They heard witnesses say he'd talked about paying to have his in-laws killed, then later said he'd do it himself. Scott testified she drove him toward Tahoe and watched him test a crude plastic pipe silencer. The defense pushed back on the grainy video and an FBI height estimate. The masked person looked about 6 foot 2 inches, which they argued didn't match him exactly, and they attacked Scott's credibility because she took a deal. Closings wrapped in early July. On July 14, 2025, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder for Gary, guilty of attempted murder for Wendy, and guilty of first-degree burglary with special circumstances, including lying in wait. He was found not guilty of child endangerment. Sentencing was set for August 18th, but has been delayed because his defense requested a continuance to consider a motion for a new trial. Around all of this, more context surfaced. Aaron said she and Serafini sold their Spohr, the bullpen, a while back, and that he'd been working in underground mining in Nevada. His baseball career, Twins, Cubs, Padres, Pirates, Reds, Rockies, ended after a steroid suspension, and money was tight afterward. In Tahoe, Wendy spoke up on housing, standing with locals as short-term rentals changed the area. The family lived in that West Shore home for 17 years. Lake Tahoe was their calm. Adrienne became the voice for her parents. Press conferences, interviews, $150,000 reward. She's talked about punching a hole in drywall the day it happened and sleeping in hospital chairs while her mom relearned the basics. When momentum dipped, she pushed. As the case moved, other personal details came out in court. Aaron and Serafini met through horses years before they married. Their relationship with Wendy and Gary was often tense. Cutoffs and reconciliations, a post-nuptial agreement, and repeated fights about money and property. By 2021, the anger in messages had sharpened. The investigation itself took time. Tahoe hadn't seen a local homicide in about 2 decades. Early on, there wasn't much to go on, besides the masked figure on video and the lack of forced entry, which pushed detectives towards someone who knew the house. It stalled, then moved again with warrants, phone records, hotel footage from Elko, and Scott's cooperation. She said she waited in a car for hours while he hid in the house, then drove him back after the shooting. She said he later broke down the gun and tossed parts into a ravine after crossing into Nevada, and that he threatened to kill her if she talked. She kept ties with Aaron for a while after, even traveling with her to Mexico in 2022 for elective surgery. Where things stand now, Serafini's been in custody since the guilty verdict. Samantha Scott is out after her accessory plea, with time served credited on the front end. The sisters' civil case is still paused, and Adrienne keeps going. Filings, hearings, steady updates, carrying her parents' story forward. Edward Frank Adams was 65 in 1987, living on Rabbit Hill Road in Wellsburg, West Virginia. Living with him was his 25-year-old son. The morning after Thanksgiving, November 27, 1987, he was found dead from a gunshot wound. Authorities treated it as a suicide. The death certificate handled it in Ohio because Adams was pronounced dead at an Ohio Valley hospital in Steubenville, listed a self-inflicted bullet wound. For nearly 4 decades, the case sat. Then, on November 10, 2024, Edward's son, James Edward Adams Sr., called 911 and said he was responsible. Later that day, at the Chester Police Department, with deputies from Brooke and Hancock counties present, he described shooting his father as he slept, wiping the weapon, and letting first responders and investigators believe it was suicide. During the interview, a deputy wrote that Adams threatened to kill his roommate if he wasn't arrested, statements that led to a separate charge of making terroristic threats. A grand jury indicted him, And less than a year later, on September 15, 2025, he stood in court, reaffirmed his confession, and pled guilty to first-degree murder. Judge Jason Cuomo sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence he could have received at trial. In court, Adams referenced prior time in an Ohio prison and a traumatic brain injury as a young adult, and said he'd carried this for decades.